Welcome to Green and Gold FC. Joining us today is former Socceroo and Australian captain, broadcaster, and one of the most prominent voices in Australian football, Craig Foster. I don't know about you at home, but he's a source of many memories, both in the commentary box and, of course, on the field. In fact, just the other day, I was watching a replay of you play in the Travellers versus True Blue exhibition.
Yeah, right. Wow. That was fun times. Yeah, fun times. Pretty crazy concept from Venables, but they pulled it off, and it was pretty good night up in Brisbane, as I remember.
Yeah, it was amazing to watch and see some of the players. And I was surprised to see that you were classified as a True Blue because I always remember you as one of the first Aussies abroad that I knew about.
Well, no, because I wasn't. Like all the guys were overseas already then, and I mean, Spider went over to Leicester, and then and then later over to Milan, and Robbie Slater and Lazaridis and all these guys were well ahead of me. I didn't go till I was 26 years old. I had quite a few injuries and mucked around a bit trying to work it out. And actually, I remember that game well because I was playing in the midfield, was having a good season, and it was pretty clear I was close to the Socceroos. And I think Johnny Cosmina was the coach of that team, the True Blues. And he said, listen, I think you should be in this other team. So, you're going to be playing whatever. It was good. That was nice of Cosy. But I remember Aurelio also on the field. It was, I mean, for guys overseas, it was, that was an exhibition game really. But I remember him saying, listen, when are you coming over? Because we were playing well. And I said, I don't know. I'll be there. I'd imagine I'll be there pretty soon. So, it was a nice memory.
Brilliant. So speaking of nice memories, we just had some nice memories and some mixed memories. We had the big World Cup hangover just a few weeks ago. How's your World Cup hangover going?
Yeah, it's always challenge after it finishes, definitely. This one was a bit different because normally I'm actually broadcasting it or on site as well. And so it's a whole experience of the country, and it was very, very special. Even, there's a lot of problems obviously in Russia, and I didn't want to go to Qatar. I did that one here. I was happy about that. But, Brazil or South Africa or even Germany, Berlin with Les and all those times. So the World Cups were always very special because it was a whole experience. Family would come over, but we'd be in a studio in one of the most picturesque places of whatever that country was. Whether it was Green Mountain or whatever it's called in Cape Town, and then we're in Copacabana, in Brazil. All that stuff. They were just great experiences. Whereas this one, I wasn't so involved. I had a chance to go and see the Socceroo games down at Fed Square with all the fans, which was lovely. I'd never done that before. But it was different. Yeah, but as soon as the World Cup is always over, there is a definite withdrawal from just the daily ritual of getting up early, watching the games, engaging in all the, polemics around it, all the arguments and all of the issues. That was a lot of fun. This one I particularly enjoyed off the field as well with Trump's intervention, the kind of Trump involvement in the World Cup, which, exposed a lot of issues around the game. The political side of the game, this time I don't enjoy that it happens, but I did enjoy, given that it's real, that it happened during this World Cup, and it was something to talk about.
Yeah, we certainly plan to talk about Infantino and some of the things you've said about some of the politics around the game. But one thing which really kept coming to my mind during this World Cup was we have a coach with a very, very pragmatic style. And I remember how passionate you were during the 2010 World Cup, and not just then, but on the World Game frequently about Australia adopting a positive playing style. I was very curious about what your thoughts were about our current playing style and whether you still have those views and whether you have some worries about us playing such a pragmatic style.
Yeah, I do. Look, my views haven't changed, but the problem is, I've been speaking about it for 20 years. So I think, people are sick of hearing it. So, what's the use of continually engaging in the same stuff? I saw Mark Milligan rightly after Australia went out again. It's Egypt talking about, what is the plan? What is the consistent way of playing? I mean, that's all great. But I mean, it was 20 years ago when we were talking about that. Right. So, I mean, football comes around in cycles in that way. We often very, very slow to learn lessons. And, and the football community, a lot of them were very challenged by those conversations at that time, which obviously, never concerned me. But it just, watching from the outside a lot now, I can see how the game's come forward a lot. And we worked very hard over decades to change the language of the game, to change the culture of the game here, to change the understanding of the game in particular, and of course, to change the level of the game. All of those were, I would say, very rapidly and very successfully changed. So the fact that so many fans are talking about that now and also were, in the end of Graham Arnold's reign or era, I think is great. It's just they don't particularly need my voice anymore. Everyone knows where I stand on it. I think it's ridiculous that we don't have a clear idea of what we're doing and how we're approaching these World Cups. We're just going one by one by one. But the fact that the fans are now asking those questions is, to me, it reinforces that the conversation was right. It was a little bit ahead of its time, as often change management is. But now it's come to life, which is great. So the other point about that is that, Hus Hiddink came in and whilst he had a measured style of play, it wasn't only reactive, which is what we effectively did almost always, aside from Venables, which my generation was under. So in the late 90s, 96, 97, when we messed up, I was going to say missed out, but messed up against Iran, that was the first time, to my knowledge, and obviously I lived through as a young guy, but in the youth national teams and all that through the Aroc era, I played under Eddie Thompson, under Raul Blanco, under Frank Farina, under Venables and some. So the only one who actually took a proactive approach and said, listen, it was a very good team actually in 97, but you guys can actually play football and I'm going to bring this kind of methodology from what he'd learned at Barca. The first one and only one to do that to that point was Venables. And then Hiddink came in, more measured, but still able to be, control the opponent, attack when necessary, but not counter-attacking football by any measure. And then what happened was, of course, I think rightly in changing the model, unfortunately, the people who came weren't always of the highest standard, which doesn't work very well in Australia. But then Hiddink essentially said, you guys need some help. He was right. And so, here's some of my Dutch friends, right? And so what happened is then we had a Dutch coach next in 2010. And so the expectation, certainly from me anyway, was that the reason that you're here is because you're going to play this sort of football and this team is still the nucleus of 2006 and they're capable of doing so. The reason I mention that, and therefore I think it's, then it's right to be saying, well, what, like that campaign, the counter-attacking football was awful in that campaign. In fact, I remember we played China at home and virtually no one turned up because the team prior to South Africa was virtually unwatchable in terms of the football, right? And so, but that's not what Australia had been sold, and that's certainly not what I thought should be happening. Anyway, the difference with Tony Popovic is very real, and that is that I would not sign a coach for Australia who plays counter-attacking football, but that's what he was signed to play, and therefore it's a little bit different. Right. So I think the conversation should happen, but the conversation is not about Tony Popovic because everyone knew why he was signed and what he is going to bring to the job. It's no use asking Tony Popovic to play a different style of football, but the conversation is different. Whereas, I think the 2010 conversation was different in that respect, is that team, there was an expectation that they were going to be playing high quality football. Now the conversation is, okay, who exactly are we? What style of football we bring players through in that particular identity and idea, and what idea is going to allow us to maximize our resources, maximize our mentality, maximize our physical qualities, which aren't determinative but are still strong for Australian sport, and therefore be successful in the long term. So there's no doubt that we have to commit to that at some point.
I'm curious how much the conversation depends on the quality of players we have. So when Venables took over, we had an amazing side.
True.
Of course, we still did in 2006.
Yeah,
when Pim Verbeek came over, the A-League came, and you mentioned quite a few times in the World Game. I think one quote from you was that we're the only league in the world which doesn't have underage teams. So a connection to grassroots.
yeah, the A League. That
And
was the A League. Yeah,
yeah. So we had like this period where the golden generation were aging, no youth were
yeah.
coming through.
Mm.
We finally got youth again, so the conversation maybe needs to change again. But does the personnel matter, or do you think we should always look to be on the front
Yeah,
foot?
that's everyone has different views on that. And my view is that if you give most coaches the opportunity to go backwards, they'll go backwards. So, in other words, who's judging the players? Right. And so we had, I mean, in 85, in 89, in 93, we had fantastic squads. I mean, the 93 squad was first class. But did that squad have people there who were able to teach and coach, a fluent, coherent system of play that's not based only on the player qualities? No, no, they didn't. And I played under those coaches later, only a few years later. And I'm telling you that just was not a thing in Australian football. I played under multiple coaches. So what we were calling for was something very new in Australian football that actually didn't really exist here. Perhaps the only one, and this is where kind of if you like, the industry memory is very short because, all of the current fans of today, they weren't around in those years. Zoran Madic with Adelaide City was one of the only coaches here who actually had a defined system of play. And he was very adamant that it had to be played in a certain way. That was the closest thing to what Venables had walked in and brought. So the answer to your question is that the player quality is it has a limit. So you're not going to win. So Australia wasn't going to win a World Cup at any time in the last 20 years with the level of players that we have. Okay, we don't have the level of players that France have, but we had good enough players playing at a reasonable level that could play a proactive style of football, certainly to qualify for World Cups. And then the question becomes, is consistency more important than just an assessment of the personnel only, in the sense that the coaches get better at it, the players come through all the national teams understanding it, and then instead of just focusing on, can we get out of the group in this particular World Cup, what you're doing is you're saying, we might not get out of the group in any particular World Cup, but what we're going to do is win it in 30 years. And we have to build slowly towards that. Building slowly towards something is not a concept that Australian football has ever been good at. In the last 15 years, we've had 3 strategic plans for our governing body, none of which have been followed. They've all been thrown out, and someone come in and now says, well, I've got the special sauce again. So we don't follow plans well, and we certainly haven't followed them in the technical sense. What we have done is provide an environment for the first time where our coaches have been able to be full-time professional, and therefore our professional coaches, because the methodology was changed and the expectations were fundamentally changed, now have accelerated, drastically, dramatically. It's been fantastic. There's other elements of the game where that hasn't happened, and where the similar type of focus and I would say pressure needs to be placed.
So one positive, one strategic plan which was carried through in 2014 was that we had these A-League academies. I'm not really sure how to divvy up credit with the new youth. Obviously, we've had Australian academies, financial troubles,
Yeah,
have caused more youth to get game
exactly.
time, and we
That's right.
had the national curriculum as well,
Yes.
and the new coaching courses. But whatever the credit goes to, we seem to be having some youth come through. They seem to be getting first team football. They seem to be going overseas, and he seemed quite positive about that.
Very.
Does it feel like it did in the 90s when we produced that purple
Mm.
patch of
Yeah.
players, or
Yeah.
do you think we
Okay.
still
It's a
have
good
a bit
question.
of a way to go?
Yeah. Yeah. So, yes, I'm very, very excited about it because it's been a long time. So, yes, the A-League was started without academies. That's like I say here in Australia. It's like running the bank Westpac and then closing down all the economics degrees in all of the universities and thinking that you're going to have, like where you're going to get people from. It just doesn't make any sense. So, that certainly compromised the level of players that Australia was producing over a period of time. That's for sure. And so there's been a number of factors. So the A-League academies have taken some time. They're still paid academies, sadly. So we're excluding a lot of talent. We could be doing much, much better. Nestor and Kunda is a great example, right? Who effectively really came from outside the system. But the A-League academies now, I think, are at a really very, very good level. The curriculum actually has been excellent. When Australian sport is told that it needs to change to something, it's always a mighty challenge. It wasn't communicated well. I was going to say sold well, but you do need to sell because people need to accept the imposition. And as I've always said, we went from the ethnic clubs, bringing up the kids with a particular view of what they thought was football, which was often very well educated, not sophisticated, but well educated. So a well-educated eye, if you like what does football look like for a Marconi kid, with Italian historic background? We had to, for the first time ever, actually have a curriculum. Now, that's a big task in a game that never had one, right? And plus, the big task here is that so much of the grassroots don't have the acumen. They're not semi-professional coaches. They're not professional coaches like in Spain, for example. They're for a long time, they're going to be parents and volunteers and these things. So you needed to provide something, a template for everyone to be able to do. It was a bit rigid at the start. I think that's probably it's unfortunate, but it's probably natural. It was the first really that had ever applied here. And everyone, including me, because I was coaching nearly 6-7 years or something at Football New South Wales, a lot of the young Matildas who are coming through now, like Courtney Nevin, Amy Sayer, all of these guys, I coached for quite a few years. We already were evolving the idea of the curriculum, the idea of the football, like decades ahead of what the document was. But it was a very good start. And one of the key reasons that it was a great start was what they call the SAP program. Okay. So when it comes to youth football, the vast majority of youth coaches in the country don't have, because they're not trained. It's not their issue. When trained like our professionals, we can become the best in the world. We always knew that. But the point is we need education. That's why all the licenses were changed here and changed to a really outstanding degree. What happened in the SAP was effectively they said, look, which came from Holland. It's similar in some ways in Spain and elsewhere, even Belgium. And that is that there's 4 core skills and you need to make sure that all of those skills are focused on, set the kids up into games which rationally provide opportunities for them to experience it. And then even if you don't have the skill to intervene or educate, those exercises are going to get them to repeat the key techniques enough times that they're definitely going to improve at them. Not at a rate that can be done, but at a much higher rate than before. So I've spent some time in the grassroots recently, and we saw our under-20s, for example, come through and win their first ever Asian Cup. Now, not only did they win it, but they won it by actually what I would say playing football. They didn't just defend. And so the book I wrote 16 years ago called Foz on Football, I went through the technical reports of all of our former youth national teams because I was in one under 16s. And what I was saying is we beat Germany and Argentina, but that doesn't mean that we beat them technically, right? And so Australia made the final in 99, I think it was 99, of the under-17 World Cup in New Zealand. But that doesn't mean we were the best football team there or that we produced the best players because we patently did not. So people were confusing results at youth, which other countries knew could be if you like, non-representational, right? We were confusing that Australian football with actually the production of world-class players. So what the SAP program did was to get a license, you had to make sure your 9 to 12-year-olds were just focusing on the key areas of the game. Now, I was here in Sydney. The reason I'm very excited is I was watching, just helping a club out here in the technical direction area. And then I was watching a game and a Central Coast team was playing in under 19s, 20s recently, only a month ago. And I was watching them and thinking, geez, that's good football. Okay. And like well organized. building up, winning the ball back, very good recoveries, pressing high, understanding, compactness, build up is excellent, movement, very good. The technical habits of the players were good, not brilliant, but, they're doing everything right, like the top level of the game, right? They're playing in a way that's allowing them to develop, which didn't happen very often 20, 25 years ago. Okay. And what happened is I said to someone, oh, geez, the young Central Coast Mariners team, they look good. There's some good players there. They're playing some good football. Who's that coach? I always ask. I go, okay, that person, that woman or that guy over there, they know what they're doing because you can see it immediately. Anyway, someone said to me, oh, that's not the Mariners. That's another league below. That's whatever league was it, MPL 2 or something. They said, oh, no, that's just Mariners, something, or that's Central Coast such and such. And I said, wow. So that's not even the professional level. Okay. We're actually starting to get somewhere in the youth, right? The prohibitive factors are you've still got a whole heap of politics at that level. The coaches are still aren't, that there's not enough of those types of coaches that we're producing. Of course, if we want to be successful, we need them to be in every club. Identification of players is still far too biased. And, we don't have a dedicated youth development license here in Australia. I think we had one for a short period of time, but we really need to focus on that. So there are a lot of things in the last 20 years or last 15 years that have been done very well, and we're starting to see the benefits of that. I mean, you saw, Millsy playing really good attacking football with Newcastle Jets last year. Well, I don't know how many, but a lot of those Jets came out of that club, are still reasonably young, or they came out of all of the A-League academies, and they're starting to become very, very nice, technically accomplished young players. In another 10 years, we continue that, keep measuring it and going. We're going to produce, we're then starting, we produce more of a population, and you're going to start to see really special players come out of it.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear. And it has been interesting seeing our youth players play very proactively and now finally get some success. One of the trade-offs people worried about, and I've heard people complain about, is that it has caused basically youth fees, at least in our light pathways, to become really expensive. Right.
Exactly.
So like a lot of people say, oh, this is because they're using youth fees to subsidize senior wages. At least
sometimes.
Yeah, that's possible. I haven't seen all 100 NPL budgets, but at least the times when I have seen an NPL budget, it looks like a lot of it goes on paying high qualified coaches and technical directors, and doesn't look like it's going towards seniors, which makes sense. If you're going to educate people more, that means they demand more. They're going to demand more money. They deserve more money, but that means that unfortunately, some people can't afford to stay in the game. I am curious, is there a way we can fix that trade-off, or is that trade-off just worth it, or what do you think?
Well, no, but it is true that a lot of clubs in NPL, NPL2 and elsewhere, they do have reasonably high fees for the youth players, and that at least some of that money, and in some clubs quite a lot, does go to the first team. That is a fact. So there's been various proposals put forward to stop that. So, you must play a minimum, and Football New South Wales, for example, in New South Wales has, you've got to have players in the team or the squad that have been at the club for a certain period of years, and or under 23, a certain number of under 23. And so there's been certain rules put into place to encourage the behaviours that you want. The one thing I would say when it comes to all of these aspects is that predominantly across Australian football, your incentives are inverse to what you need to see. This is that if I had to sum up Australian grassroots football, and even much of what happens in the A-League sometimes in Football Australia, that would be my comment. The federated model is one of those. So the incentives for Football New South Wales chairperson or CEO is not to support the broader effort. It is not to, automatically buy into what we're doing on a national level, which sometimes makes compromise at state level. It is to do what is in the best interest of Football New South Wales, and that is an inverse incentive to the well-being of Australian football, in my view. That's one reason why I believe we need final governance reform. I don't think we're ever going to get to where we should get with all of our states effectively looking after their own narrow interests, not always, but by definition, a lot of the time. And I believe that we need a national approach with localized solutions. That's a very different thing. Okay. When it comes to the high costs of academies, high cost to play across the country, it's a very serious issue because it's excluding a lot of talent, and still lack of investment in girls' game and in the women's game. Even you can see in the APL. So there are big structural challenges that we have to overcome, and many of them, the biggest hurdle is finance, lack of money, and a bottom-up approach still. I'm not aware of any money that actually comes from top down. The game's simply not in that position, and certainly not in recent years when Football Australia's making a loss. So usually in other fields, of course, other games, that comes largely from broadcast. So if we're getting 30 million, I don't know what they're getting from Paramount these days, and pure cash is even more rare, but let's just say the figure is 25, 30 million per year. I'm not sure. That's, half of what they were getting, I don't know if it was 10 years ago, 8 years ago, whatever, from Fox Sports. It's already been halved. Now, that figure, you'd have to check, but it's at least 10 times as much for the other major sports in the country, if not more. So, you're talking about 300 million, not 30 million. So, that is, those numbers are transformative. So we're still talking to the government about we need funds. And so the game needs to work out how we can finally capitalize on our scale, on our multiple levels of support, fan support. And that's the big puzzle that hasn't been solved. It was solved for a very short period of time in the A-League. So we had reasonably big crowds, or very big crowds compared to today. We even had 50,000 plus for a Sydney derby at one point in time. But predominantly the clubs were still losing money at that stage. And there was an idea that eventually we're going to see the light here and we're building. That's not where we're at today. So yeah, this is, they're the big challenge that we have. Again, I come back to governance reform, because the issue with a multi-level, multi-interest governance federated system is that you can never aggregate the mass of the game. And so Australian football is forever saying, yeah, we've got all these problems over here, but we're the biggest participant sport in the country, and look how great we are. That's fine if you could actually speak to all those people in a consistent manner to enable them to support the games at the various levels, which is beneficial to the overall well-being of the game. Okay? And we still can't do that. The A-League clubs still aren't able to. I think there's been an agreement with Football Australia recently, but as a general principle, where if we've got 2 million people playing the game, some registered, some not, 2 million people in church leagues and school leagues and all sorts of stuff, right? How do we get those 2 million people acting as a block in order to support the local game, along with our national teams, which is also supporting the local game, along with their fandom of, for instance, Manchester United or PSG or anyone else? That's the big question that the game hasn't solved. And one big part of that is absence of the correct governance model to actually facilitate messages from top to bottom. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so there's probably 3 points I want to follow up on there. So I'll do them one at a time. But I'll, I want to mention about the junior fees and subsidizing seniors, A-League crowds and how they've declined, and then, of course, governance. But let's start with, I want to have one follow-up question about the junior fees subsidizing seniors. So I've only asked 2 clubs out of 100. And in both those cases, it was actually just the cost of the coaches, and they weren't subsidizing the seniors. But of course, you say there are examples, so I don't know about those examples. But the clubs, at least, which aren't doing this, but still charging a lot, they kind of seem to feel that this is a stick used to beat up grassroots clubs, and they feel like we're ignored already. Would it be beneficial to everyone if we just had like some financial transparency mandators? Like you have to say what your fees go to. This is the public itemized bill sort of thing, because that would stop people from supporting the seniors using using fees, and it also means that clubs that aren't doing that aren't getting that stick.
So it's a bit like Australian politics, I think. You're only in government for 3 years, and therefore you're just going to change the CGT and do this and a little bit with super and stuff, but you're not going to, hurt the multinationals, and you're not going to hurt, Australia's richest people. You're not going to tax our resources. In other words, you need to look at the whole picture, and we're all searching for, the magic wand, and what is, the big decision that's going to fix the grassroots. It's not going to happen because there are a range of issues. For example, the academy system that has grown up is a very serious threat to the game, in my view. And, I always say, look, because there's limited positions within the game, because the game cannot support well-paid coaching positions more than like $4,000 or something, 4 days a week, even in NPL 1, you want to take the under-18s of an NPL 1 team, or NPL as they call it in New South Wales. That's probably, for most clubs, around the level that you're looking at. You're talking about 10, maybe 11 months of the year, 4 days a week. So, and plus their petrol, and, they're getting all here in Sydney, so these people are spending a huge amount of time to try and build a career. That's not sustainable, and that's not, because it's not going to encourage your very best people to stay in the game and really be committed to that. That's why everyone is scrambling to get into the A-League environment as a young coach or a youth coach or whatever it is, because at least they can be paid to a reasonable level and they can commit themselves to the profession. So again, it's inverse incentives. What does Australian football need? We need outstanding youth coaches. And what's happening at the moment is there's no financial incentive. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And therefore, there's not an incentive to get educated. The licenses are far too costly. So I did my pro license. I think it cost like about 15 grand in total by the time I got through the 4 licenses. I started at the C. I wanted to learn what the methodology was as much as, go and coach some of the best kids in the country. I was at the forefront of changing our methodology. I was the one saying our methodology is not good enough. People getting upset all over the place. I was saying it's not good enough. I've played here. I've seen this. I've seen the best coaching, and we need better licenses. We want to produce the best coaches in the world. And the coaches are very upset at that time. They were saying, oh, but how can you say this? So it's not about talent. Australia has immense sporting and intellectual talent. It's got nothing to do with that. It's that we need the best education in the world, and we are nowhere near it. In fact, in 2005, I was so upset about what I saw when I came back from abroad and what I'd seen in the Socceroos that, I brought Amajake over to Sydney for the first conference here for 3 days, and all of our national coaches and, that time, 2005, I don't know, ex-NSL coaches and everyone came. We had over 400 coaches because that just hadn't happened before. And my view was that I was perfectly, happy to say on SBS all the time, we need to open up intellectually, and we need to challenge ourselves to be among the best in the world, and we have to let information in. And so therefore I contacted Amajake. He won the World Cup in France 98 as the coach. He was then the TD. He was in his late 60s, I think. He was a TD of France at that time in 2005 already. And of course, they were producing many of the best players in the world. And so I brought him over along with the PFA. I went to the PFA here and said, okay, listen, I've written to him. He's come back. He's interested in coming. He came with Martine, his wife, and we spent a week together, and he did 3 days, with some assistants, right? And he showed us what they do in France. That was the start of just saying to Australian intellectual, leaders, if you like, I would say gatekeepers at the time, that that's no longer enough. That's no longer good enough. We're going to bring in the best thinking in the world. And then Hiddink came in 2006, of course. And what Hiddink did was he allowed me to say, that's the level we need to hit. And we want coaches there, right? And so, all these things were very challenging to an Australian closed football system, that really didn't want to challenge itself too much. So again, I'm just talking about perverse incentives or inverse incentives, often perverse, right? And so, what I'm saying about the academies is, so therefore many former players are deeply committed to helping young players do what they did and go beyond. That's wonderful. Because the game can't employ them on a reasonable, even livable salary, and they've been professional athletes, in which case they were well paid. And now people are saying, well, come in here and coach the under 16s and we're going to give you a couple of $1,000 a year. It's like, what are you talking about? So I understand where they're coming from. So the easiest thing to do now is, so I'll have my own academy and I'll just have 100 kids. I don't know what, let's say, I charge them $5,000 a year. I've got 100 kids, and all of a sudden everyone's got an academy.
Yeah.
Right. So, I go around here in eastern suburbs. I mean, we've got a Brazilian academy. We've got this academy. We've got ex-players. We've got, there's more academies than clubs now. That disturbs me, a lot. And the ex-players who have academies, don't like me saying that. I said back when I wrote the book, I said, listen, I don't believe in a paid academy system in Australia because I wouldn't have been able to afford it. Nestory and Kunda couldn't afford it. All the new arrivals can't afford it. Most of the multicultural communities can't afford it. All of the Sudanese kids can't afford it. That's for sure. Look at Awe Mabil. Look at Burundi, Nestory and Kunda. Like, where are these kids coming from? You think they're paying $5,000 a year for 10 years? At Football New South Wales, when I walked in there, they'd had the curver system and I remember I walked in as the under 16 coach or something a few years ago. And I took the trial and I said, oh my God, far out. I don't know these players so it was the current players from the year before in under 15s and then trialists. And so I picked a squad of 18 and I can't recall, but it might have been 5 players from the previous year in that squad. And all the parents came to me and said, oh, how's this possible? They were all upset because they said, oh, my son's been in here for 5 years and you're saying he's not a good player. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but he's not. I don't know who's been teaching them, but they're not even on the level of these other ones here that's walking out of the clubs, whatever. And they said, oh, I'm so upset because I've spent $100,000 in the last 5 years. And I said, how the hell can you spend $100,000? And they said, well, because we were encouraged not only to pay to be in this program, but then we had to go to Japan on a trip with Curver. And then we had to go, because they had the Curver license. And then we went to UK and we played against Chelsea and we were made to feel, this is what they told me. This is what they said to me. They said, and we were made to feel that if family members didn't go, then we weren't committed to our son's career. So we all went. So we'd have 5 tickets. So, that's a lot of travel profit. And so this was all, what was going on. So in other words, I've been around a long time. So I've been through all of these iterations and I've seen improvement and I acknowledge them. Like I said, I'm very excited about and I'm delighted with where most of the A-League academies are at the moment. I think they're doing much, much, much better work, really good work. But the grassroots is still really, in most ways, chaotic. The programs have been much better, and it's at least allowed the kids to develop their techniques in a way they would not have done. And don't forget, I think in 2002, 2003, I don't know what it was, I was at SBS, but I was pushing small-sided games in Australia because I did my research. Around that time, I went to Barcelona 5 times. I went to Spain to see. I went to France. I bought Jacques here, all that stuff. And I said, I'm not doing my licenses. Although I would like to coach, I'm not going to do the licenses. Well, I went to see them and I said, they're not good enough. And so I'll do them when we change them. And then they did a great job changing them, right? So I used to go around to the clubs and associations in New South Wales arguing for small-sided games, like don't play 11 aside. And that was based on data. That wasn't Craig Foster's idea. I looked at what Germany were doing. I looked at what Holland were doing. I looked at what France were doing, even the USA, what they were doing. And all of the research said that, more touches means, it's like wanting to become a tennis player when you're tiny and just playing on a big court and hitting the ball 5 times in an hour session and then thinking that you're going to be a pro. It just doesn't make any sense. So, there has been this incremental changes and many of them have been a big challenge culturally along the way. People push back a lot, even ex-players. But we're in a place now where the governance reform is the final part of the puzzle, and without it, we can't get the clubs organised well enough so that a kid doesn't need to pay $5,000 to go to an academy. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And why am I talking about that? Is simply because there's too many kids, Indigenous kids. There's too many kids all across the country. They can't afford it. It's unregulated, and therefore, it's again the incentives aren't right for us to either create the biggest number of good players. You get a few. You might get 100 good players out of academies because you're getting a lot of talent. But what I want is 1,000. What I want is 10,000. What I want is 15,000. I don't want just a couple coming out, of families who have the money to pay. And then you say, oh, well, yeah, but we give scholarships. Yeah, okay, fine. They're businesses. Okay. Football should not be a business when it comes to a kid having opportunity to be in a superb developmental environment, both as a person and a footballer. That should be our principle. That should be our philosophy. It's not. What we've done is we've just put our hands up and said we can't fix it. And now what you've got is clubs saying, well, because the academies are on the outside and they're killing us, we've got 2 trainings a week, and then little Alice is going over here and paying. We'll do our own academies, bring them in-house. And then, so we're making the money and sharing the money. Well, the kid's still getting charged. So these are serious structural problems. And what worries me is that this is the way the US went. The US were the first really to massively hyper-commercialize youth football. And they're still arguing about it. When the US team went out, the big argument in US between all ex-players and development people is, what do we, it's all about cost. It's all about profit. We're becoming all about profit here. And so that's, so where I think we started was it's not just one solution. We need to have a look at how we can, and the 2 things are governance reform and commercializing the game to the degree. By governance reform, you unite the football community so that the aggregate of our mass is also an aggregate commercial quantum. At the moment, it's split. Like I reckon the academies must be taking, maybe $200 million or something out of the game. Oh, easy. I'd be surprised if it wasn't double. Right?
That's
I mean, they're
the entire revenue
everywhere.
of the A-League.
So, and no one wants to really confront these things, and I'm in a fortunate position. Firstly, I played, so, I have some financial stability. Secondly, obviously I'm a broadcaster. So I acknowledge that, I am not as an ex-player where I'm in a position where I need to do an academy to survive. And, and someone's offering me $4,000 and I'm like, well, I get the structural problems, but I think that we need to fix them rather than lean into them further and just give up. In other words, what I'm saying to all the ex-players and people who have academies is I want you in the system earning good money. You're not going to earn $500,000 a year because, again, let's just say finally on that, and the reason I'm talking about it is I think it's a very serious issue in Australian football, but even the incentives in academies are inverse. And how do I know this? Because I earned like $14,000 for being the Football New South Wales coach. The first 2 years, I think I earned $4,000. And I was there. And so what I know is that if you're in an academy and you're charging a parent $5,000 or $3,000 a year, whatever it is, you are not incentivized to properly work on that child's personal or football development. Because if you do, often you have to challenge the child and be honest to the parents. And therefore, when you do that, they're likely to go to another academy. I've seen it happen.
Mm-hmm.
Because what the other academy says is, oh no, Johnny's wrong. I think he's an unbelievable player and he's going to be a Socceroo. Bring him to me and I'll make him into AC Milan. The kid's not going anywhere near AC Milan and everyone's clear about that. But if they're honest and put the child in a developmental environment as quickly as possible, they may well be, a professional player. Okay. So in other words, those incentives are wrong as well. So people saying that the paid academy systems is going to make us win the World Cup, that's just fundamentally wrong. We need a system that outstanding coaches are measured, verified, so that it's not just sales. And there are many in the academy system, just like there are great coaches in the club system, right? They're everywhere. I want a system in Australia, data-driven, where we know who the best coaches are, and then you're going to be well paid to do a fantastic job with all of our players or maybe our best young talent, and we're going to get the proper funnel going from primary schools all the way up, with a very high level of coaching acumen, and then we're laughing. Then we're going to win World Cups and we're going to be successful domestically and commercially.
So you mentioned that it all comes back to governance reform rather than individual policies. I've heard a lot of thoughts about governance reform. I think one popular idea is abolishing the state feds, but then some of the pushback is that is grassroots clubs say, well, we already have a lot of trouble getting our voice heard already, and if you abolish the state feds, maybe it'd be harder. Often mentioning the makeup of Congress. If you were dictator for a month of Football Australia, what sort of governance model would you have? What things would you fix?
Yeah.
How would you get the incentives
Firstly,
to be right?
Firstly, I'm anti-authoritarian, and therefore, what I would be doing is the one thing Australian football does not do well is get its best minds together and actually make the best plans. And most of our best minds and best operators are very quickly externalized by the game. So we need cultural reform as well. Anyway, so therefore, what I would do is just go to the best minds in Australian football and let's work out how it is that we're going to reform it. Of course, the current voting systems work very much against that. So it's not in the interests, for example, of the states to reform the game, which is why it's unlikely to happen, which is why it'll only happen with external intervention, I think, of players and fans. And I'm hopeful that the game doesn't have to get to a low enough ebb whereby, that needs to be forced through. But, we had the Crawford report many decades ago. We were there. And what that did is effectively talked about a unitary model. And so what you have is, so I don't quite understand the reasoning of, grassroots clubs or Football New South Wales, for example, to say, well, if we were effectively out of existence, there's something that we're doing that can't be done. We need to be in existence in order for these grassroots clubs to receive exactly this from us that a national body can't do at state level. I'm yet to hear what that thing exactly is. I'll tell you the opposite. What the current structure can't do is aggregate the mass of the game effectively. What Football Australia has to do is say to Football New South Wales, Football Tasmania, whatever, listen, would you guys mind, or let's do an MOU, or let's create an agreement whereby we'll share with this, this with you, you can share this with us, we'll respect these boundaries with you, you can respect these boundaries with us. Here's what we want to do nationally. Is that okay with you? Can you agree with that? That I don't like. I think we should have the best people at the top of the game. We don't. I think we should have the best governors on the board. We certainly don't have that. And then I think we should have the best plans implemented locally. And that needs a network of support around the country there, so that grassroots clubs have an immediate feedback and support and so on at a localized level. Of course, that's what you need. But I would reject the proposition that the only way to do that is a federated governance model, which often works against the overall interests of the game.
Probably a lot of the fear of getting rid of the federated model comes from the current structure of Congress. So probably if you change a whole bunch of moving parts at the same time, those fears could be alleviated. So one really big piece of division in Australia is the fact that we don't have promotion relegation, which is the norm in so many different countries in the world. And I'm curious, is this something caused by the incentive structures that we have currently in the game? I know that in Australia also, it's divisive in USA, we're not having promotion relegation, but in Australia particularly, because we had essentially this scorched earth approach, removing all the ethnic clubs, and promotion relegation also has been tied up with that big culture war we've had in Australia about, whether you can have clubs which are proud of their migrant heritage at the top level. And of course, we had Socceroo on this show, who's talked in details about how lack of promotion relegation accidentally creates these incentive structures to drive up junior fees. So I am curious, how much of this connects to promotion relegation, and what your thoughts about whether it's even possible in Australia to have promotion relegation.
Yeah, so we ultimately have to have it, in my view. It's an important part of the game. It's an important part of incentivization in the game, and it also increases opportunity. So again, let's go back to first principles. What is it that we're trying to achieve? This is why the overall strategy of the game is critically important, and I'm not even sure we have one anymore. Certainly the community doesn't know about it. The reason is because we need to maximize the number of opportunities for young players to play at a semi-professional or professional level. We need to maximize the opportunity for youth coaches to grow in an environment where they're well paid and they can focus on their craft. Otherwise, we're never going to produce the players that we should be able to. We're up against countries where if you're an under-8 coach, or certainly if you're an under-12, under-14 coach, you're full-time, you're full professional. So that's where we need to get. We need to make that. Therefore, one league is not enough opportunities for players, and it's not enough opportunities for us to excel. So we need two leagues at a minimum. Now, the only way that you can incentivize that level to be professional enough to do so, in my view, is through the opportunity to rise up into the top level. And you've seen that, which what has been one of the best innovations of recent years is actually the Australia Cup. Because what the Australia Cup did was it put NSL, so it put prospective A-League and A-League, women's A-League clubs in a position where they all of a sudden thought that, not just the Australia Cup, but the championship in particular. And the reason is because that's aspirational. So what you've seen is a lowering of the distance between this is in the men, the A-League and the NPL clubs, right? Or effectively the championship clubs. And that comes out in the Australia Cup. But that's because all of a sudden they believe that a number of them are going to have the opportunity to step up at some point. And so that is the correct incentive. You just have to have rules in place to make sure that it's all spent properly and so on, right? And that they have enough young team. You have a challenge that you go back into the same cycle as what the A-League used to do. Graham Arnold saying, it's not a development league, and very few kids playing. And then COVID hit, and all of a sudden we produced all the players because they've had experience at a professional level. So you need to understand, what does an optimal A-League look like? I keep asking the PFA this. I say, what is the optimal A-League for you guys? It shouldn't be a youth league. We know that, because you need to have a highest level of competition possible, A, to draw crowds, and B, that when your young players step into that league, that they are developed at the right speed. But let's be clear that it's already a very, very good level. I mean, Lucas Harrington walked out. He didn't spend very long in the MLS before he was sold for $30 million. Okay. So, Australian football needs to be careful talking it down too much. Like I would sit and watch Adelaide, pay to sit and watch Adelaide under Ayrton, and pay to sit and watch Newcastle under Millsy any day of the week.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I would be wearing that shirt, if I was from Newcastle and wasn't a broadcaster, I'd be wearing that shirt and I'd be in that stadium. I'd be saying, this is fantastic football. Okay. And Lucas Harrington came out of Brisbane Roar. How long was he in the MLS?
5 months. Yeah.
6 months does not make a player. Okay. The player is made here. All that's happened is he's gone into a league whereby they've got a lot more ex-European professionals. So arguably now the level would be slightly higher than Australia, whereas it never was before in the Beckham era and so on. They only had one or two per team, whatever. Now they've risen the level, I think, quite a lot. But he just went into the league that has much more respect from European clubs, right? So there's no reason why they shouldn't have bought him from here for 30 million. Okay. So that's what Australian football needs to wrestle with, is, underestimating itself at the same time as being aggressive in how we want to improve and identifying the shortfalls and wanting to build it up, but often it's too pessimistic. I'm the opposite. I'm always very, very optimistic about Australian football and our players and what we can do and where we should go. But I also challenge the game, in the areas where we're falling short. I think Australian football clearly takes that too far very often. Right? So I believe that we need, relegation and promotion for broader developmental reasons as much and for positive incentives for these clubs to actually improve. So now Heidelberg, have done a great job in the Australia Cup, Australia Championship. They want to invest more. All of a sudden you've got a lot of former players coming into those roles. They want to coach in the Australian Championship now. That's the opportunity to be seen by A-League clubs. You got Ognanovsky going, for example, to MacArthur. That's all. That wasn't happening before. Now you've got potential, the beginning of your coaches stepping out of NPL into A-League. That's what should be happening. Okay. But the level needs to rise below. So the level wasn't ready before. The difference between an $8 million, whatever it was, $8 million squad salary spend per year and like $500,000 was just too much 2 or 3 years ago. And now we're starting to see better investment at that level. And of course it needs to be sustainable, but anyway. And then we're starting to see the levels converge and it's becoming possible. The final issue with it, whilst I agree with it, is the A-League itself is not commercially sustainable. So the idea that clubs below all of a sudden are going to be commercially sustainable when you're going from, so an NPL club is spending, the big ones are spending 800,000, maybe some over $1 million, on salary spend. And what is it in the A-League currently? I'm not even sure, but it might be 6 million or something, right? 6 million.
4.8 according to Conray.
You're talking about, okay, great. So it's a massive, massive jump. So, you need to, so in other words, the commercial value and the numbers of the game, the economics of first tier and second tier need to be improved to such a point where the standards have converged, and then you open the door and all of a sudden it's not too much of a jump to also go there. And it's not too much of a bottom out to drop down. So in other words, you talk about inverse incentives again. So you're asking people to spend $16 million on an A-League license. And then in the same breath, you're saying, well, in 2 years' time, you could drop out of the A-League and all of a sudden you're going to have zero income, effectively. You're just going to be whatever, right? That just doesn't work. So you need to develop the economics of both levels so that then you can do both. And of course, the EPL has a balloon payment when someone drops out, and all of these types of mechanisms are there for a very good reason. That it's that economics which we need to get hold of. But of course, the economics of the A-League itself are in flux, if not trouble at the moment, and Football Australia. So this is a big challenge. But that's the way I see it. Of course, it needs to happen, number one. It needs to happen for these big strategic reasons, not just to bring back, South Melbourne or any other legendary club. It has to work for the benefit of all of Australian football. It does, in my view. Third, you need to put the principles in place and the building blocks to make sure that people can reasonably go up. They've got the professionalism and the revenues and the backing, and that they can reasonably come down, survive, have opportunity to go back up again. It's a big job. That's a big job.
So 100% agree with that. And I like the idea of parachute payments because I think that's been a big concern is how do A-League clubs survive? And so that's some of the economics which needs to be thought about. I want to circle back as our final topic. You mentioned how the World Cup brought up some of the governance issues, not just in Australia, but globally, and some of the politicization of FIFA and everything. You've been very critical of Infantino over the last couple of months.
Yeah.
Of course, there's a handling of Florian Balogun's suspension. I think Donald Trump said he got the card overturned. FIFA tried to claim it had nothing to do with Trump, and Trump says, "No, it was me who did it," which was fairly classic. And then, of course, after that, we had like essentially the privatization of the World Cup, which ultimately got rejected. I was curious about what you thought of Footballers Australia's response. Should we have been a little bit stronger, have a stronger response in to what's happening at FIFA, and what we can do as fans?
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I think the game's in a very bad place from a governance perspective. A part of the World Cup was almost sold off to Trump's, son-in-law's brother. That tells you everything. Like so, and sold off under duress. In a short time frame, effectively forcing federations to do so at penalty of losing some of their development funding. Or not getting an extra incentive. That's absolutely disgraceful. So that to me is a sacking offence from any president who's done that for a whole, and the Balogun affair. So to me, it's an absolute farce. So fans and players have an obligation, and former players. They're the three. I don't expect unbelievable governance out of football. Certainly not out of FIFA. I think you need very strong safeguard mechanisms outside of FIFA. That's why Infantino weakened drastically the ethics committee almost immediately after walking in. I've dealt with FIFA a number of times, so I know them very well. I know them better than most players. I dealt with FIFA directly on the Hakeem case, for example. I saw inside the tent, I saw the politics, I saw how they were prepared to act. And I learned a lot through that process. I also have, as the former chair of the PFA here, CEO at one point and various times, had something to do over a period of time with FIFA Pro, which is the global players body, which itself has its own political issues, and I don't expect them to reform the game. They're just simply not strong enough. And therefore, I think it's going to fall on the fans and probably the former players because that's where the real leverage is, and the players. But I don't hold out a huge amount of hope at the moment that the players' union globally is going to reform itself in order to be able to create great leverage with FIFA, understanding what's going on behind the scenes, if you like. So former players, I think, need to be put into a position where there is an expectation for them all to stand up for the game. And I don't think the game has that. So, and that's for a variety of reasons, because we are the global game. So, the idea of a hegemonic culture is not real, but also because fans have such a personal relationship with their loved star, it's often difficult to then turn around and say, well, I have a greater expectation of them. I think somehow the game needs to build that and to say, listen, we've invested all this emotion in you, but also financially, you guys are, you're setting yourselves up for life, and you've got a brand now that is powerful in the game, but you have a direct responsibility back to the game as a former player. This goes as much for Australian players as anyone anywhere in the world. And when the game has clear corruption, when it has clear political interference, when these major thresholds are breached, as they were in Bladder's era, we expect you to do something and say something. And in fact, it's not enough just to be close to FIFA, be in the FIFA legends, travel first class, get all of the benefits without having some responsibility to actually protect the game for us, as fans all around the world. I think that that's the way that fans should start to think about the responsibility of former players. And I think that's perfectly rational, that's perfectly fair. And because, we as former players, we've, of course we invested everything in the game, but the game has also given us everything, right? And therefore we have, a duty to actually make sure that we give back constantly, not just take our whole lives from the game.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't happen enough. The greatest player and the only one really to speak out against FIFA and call them corrupt and all that stuff was Diego. Right. And, you guys might be too young, but our generation, I very well remember Diego calling FIFA corrupt all the time. And he was the best player in the world, maybe the best player ever at that time. And there was no incentive for him to actually say that. That's one reason why I loved him. Whereas most players they want more sponsors, they want more, political capital, they want more social capital, they want to just travel, be at World Cups and just be seen as a legend. He was the greatest, he was probably the best known human on the planet at the time. And there was every incentive for Diego to be shutting his mouth and saying, give me another sponsorship. Here I am with Bladder. Here I am with FIFA or whoever was running at the time. Here I am. Let's have another pair of boots. And, there was every incentive. That's what most of them do. And yet he was saying they're corrupt. I don't want to know about them. Pele was different. Pele became a sports minister. He was very politically minded. He was very commercial in his thinking. He was we always had loads of sponsors and so on. And to my knowledge, I don't think he ever spoke out about corruption in the game. Well, if you imagine that FIFA got themselves under Bladder into a position where the FBI needed to intervene, okay, it's worthwhile going back and looking at that period and say, well, who actually said anything? Like, how can that game be in a position where the FBI need to literally haul people off to jail, and yet the biggest players in the world, former players, I'm not talking about current players because they got their profession, they're focused on that, and many of them speak out on a range of things, which is wonderful. I like them too, but I don't think they should be pressured to do so. But former players, yes. And how many of them said anything? Oh, I can't really remember any aside from Diego. So that's always been the problem in the game. The game carries so much public wealth, financial, branding, reputational wealth, so much as the biggest game in the world, that it's so seductive for former players to be close to FIFA. It actually doesn't matter what they do. Right? You saw Samuel Eto'o come out today. It's in his political interest, he sees, to be supporting Infantino even after what he's done. I'm not surprised by that in any way. That's what most former players are like. So that culture needs to change. Okay, so that's my answer to your question, is that fans must have a different expectation of former players, and fans need to be much better organised. So I spoke to the fan supporters group of Australia recently and said, you guys need to encourage a global organisation, because all I ever see is football supporters Europe, and I see football supporters Australia, and I see football supporters somewhere else. But what I want to see is global football supporters that's representing 500,000 supporters around the world. And those 500,000 supporters have these principles in place where they say this is non-negotiable, or we're not turning up and we're not buying shirts and we're not buying the premium, membership. And they can be pretty simple things. But then when that doesn't happen, and when we see corruption, or when we see you trying to sell these things off, we have leverage now. We can take action. We're going to withdraw. It's like employees always say, we withdraw our labour. That's why we had a strike with the Socceroos in 1997. You're going to treat us like this? We're going to withdraw our labour and we're not going to play. And you're going to realise very quickly that we are the game. You're not the game. And we don't care if you're the chair of Soccer Australia or the CEO of Soccer Australia. Your job is only to manage our game. We're the players. And therefore, you need to make sure that the players and the fans and the game is looked after, not yourselves. That's the position that the fans need to be in my view, where they say, no. The players and us are the game. We fund it. Without us in the stands, there is no TV coverage, right? And we are organised, and this is how we want football to look in future, because it's our labour. We get to the stadium, we buy the shirts, we buy the thing, we cheer the players, we do the songs, we do the tifos. Right? That's our labour, and therefore we're organised and we can withdraw it if necessary. Without that, we're just going to be back here in another 10 years. There's no doubt about that. You just get another Infantino. It's just a different surname.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's remarkable that we are now in a situation where Sepp Blatter looks good by comparison, just how far things have sunk.
That's that's almost true. Except if you go back and have a real, you go back and have a really good look, it was actually bad. People have short memories. But I went back and watched one of the documentaries before, and of course I was there during that time. Andrew Jennings, turning up to all the FIFA events was very, very funny. And well done to him because he just did not give up.
So I want to end on a high note because
Okay.
obviously Infantino is no one's source of optimism right now. But could we just think, despite all the frustrations and challenges we've talked about today, what gives you the most future hope about the future of the game here?
Yeah, because I think all Australian football fans should recognise that we've won the majority of battles that last 25 years ago. They were, we were at the start of them, right? So Australia didn't care about the Matildas. They had no conditions. They had no brand. They were wonderful players, unbelievable. Julie Murray was the first MVP, I think, non-US player or something in the women's league in the US, which was the strongest. When they were winning, I think it was 99 or so, when they were winning World Cups, the US women. She went over there and just absolutely obliterated the whole tournament. She was our captain of the Matildas. Cheryl Salisbury was an unbelievable player, played in the FIFA World 11 and stuff, but no one knew about them. They certainly weren't getting paid, and they were sitting in economy. Well, so were we actually at the time. But they were amateur. They had to give up their jobs. They couldn't have families. So we should always remember how far we've come. There's been a lot of battles. I've been right in the middle of the majority of them for 30 years. So I've seen how far we've come, and we had a World Cup on home soil, 2023. I mean, it was a dream to have a Women's World Cup on home soil 25 years ago. We're making regularly round of 16s, round of 32s, getting out of the group with the Socceroos. That's wonderful on our journey, right? But, we want more, but we still need to recognize that this is, we've just played in our 6th consecutive World Cup, right? So, we need to make sure that somehow we create a culture in Australian football where we capture the good, and we always acknowledge the good, and then we really, really challenge where it is that we need to go, and we're very strong on excellence, accountability, innovation, the best thinking, and everyone needs to provide that at every level of the game, including me as a broadcaster. And if I don't, then I should be criticised, heavily criticised. But at the same time, it's all about standards. It's not about the people. It's always about the standards, of our national teams, of our broadcasters, of our broadcast, of the standard on the field, all of those things. Because there's a lot to like about where we've got to. We're now starting to get players valued, 30 million plus, our most valuable ever. Mind you, the market has moved in the last 20 years, and I would hate to think what, a Paul Ocon or, even a Frank Farina, or a Stanley Lazaridis, or these guys would be valued today. But anyway, so there's a lot of great stuff. But my question is always, what is the culture that we're trying to create in Australian football? We have to be conscious about that.
Mm-hmm.
And the culture needs to be evidence-based, research-driven, excellence, best thinking. If you don't have the best thinking, if you're not pushing the game forward, don't be in the public domain making comments or the game should be saying like, what, okay, everyone has the right to be speaking, but we're not listening to you. We're listening to people who are actually pushing the game forward all the time. Excellence, wanting to be the best in the world, ethical, strong about what the game gives to Australian society, and fiercely proud of that, and always promoting what Australia does, what Australian football does for Australia. They, I'd say, would be like the 8 key principles that Australia should be focused on, because that's culture. when you focus on particular things, you produce repeating behaviors. And at the moment, our behaviors are in many respects not conducive. I wouldn't say wrong, but they're not maximally conducive to the well-being and the excellence of Australian football. In many ways, we hold ourselves back because our behaviors aren't pushing us forward, in other words.
Mhm. So we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. We could listen to you for hours. We really appreciate you giving us your time and
No worries.
perspective. And
All
for
good.
those at home, don't forget we're on greenandgoldfc.com. You join us on the forum. Give us your views if you think any of our views are you agree with or you disagree with, or you think one of us is crazy. Anything's okay.
Right.
Just give your opinion. We are also on Twitter, Spotify, and Apple. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, that's all we have time for. It's bye for now.